All right, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the In Liberty and Health podcast. If you were watching this, this was originally recorded on February 12th, 2025. I'm showing you this now because if you're listening to this live as a premiere, I am at Jurgles and we're getting ready to open for Lynch Mob on the Final Farewell Tour. So hopefully, if you're within the area, then you are there, and I'm buying you a drink right now. Anyways, I invited my friend Jason Smith back on to talk about China, some of the foreign policy implications with the Trump administration, how Chinese people and Chinese culture kind of views Trump. And then we also kind of got into some of the things that I talk about a lot on this podcast about some of the Uyghur stuff and also, prices, foreign policy surrounding China. And then more towards the end, I'll cut in a little video where we share receipts. And he did actually get me a receipt of some of the stuff that he bought in China. And we kind of discuss the cost of living in the US versus China. So this is going to be a really, really interesting episode. And hopefully all the editing and, cutting it all together turns out pretty well. And you guys really, really enjoy this and get some education out of this as well. Because I always enjoy doing these kind of podcasts where I talk about, the differences in culture and the way that foreign countries kind of view the US. So Jason is not only a friend, but he also lived in America for a certain period of time. And I think he's lived in China now for over 10 years. So this is just an absolutely fascinating conversation. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation today with Jason Smith from Bridge to China. All right, everybody. Welcoming back to the show, my dear friend, Jason Smith. How you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. And as I told you off air, I just have so many questions I want to bounce off you because I find you to be a wealth of knowledge when it comes to one of my passion projects in this goofy podcasting world, and that's China. So I guess let's kind of start with first things first. What has been the general reaction on the ground to the election? Well, I should say re-election of Donald Trump.
I'm really surprised by this. And this also happened in 2016.
Mhm.
There are a lot of fans of China, of Trump in China. He is
Mm.
really well liked. And there are lots of people on like Xiaohongshu and Douyin who impersonate him. And because he says China a lot, he talks about China. He actually
Same.
talks about China in a positive way. So
Mhm.
Chinese people, they don't look into the really deep parts of US politics. They're looking
Of
at the
course.
big picture, so they don't know all the nuance of fights that Democrats and Republicans are having. They just see the big picture. And I think most Chinese people actually, I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking about regular people.
Sure.
Regular people really like Trump. And they think he's very entertaining and they think he seems honest. And I think he's actually really beloved by a lot of people here, to my shock, actually.
Yeah, that's very surprising because I know Trump has said such things as China is or it's sexually copulating us, if that's the way to put it in YouTube friendly words. And then also he, completely fills his administration with what we would deem as China hawks, Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, and then now with somebody who's going to be having more of like I don't want to say administrative, but more of like a think tank kind of position. Elbridge Colby, who's explicitly called for war with China over Taiwan. So, do you know in the general population if there's any kind of sentiment with how they view that, or is it just kind of like that's out of sight, out of mind?
Well, it's always not, it's not about everyone because there is nuance. If you go online, you see that there are experts on Sino-US relations, and people like Colby specifically, out of
Yeah.
all of the people you mentioned,
Mhm.
are the people are very concerned about him. I think
Sure.
his official position is let's arm Taiwan to the teeth. So
Yeah.
like that is really where he wants to go with that, and that's not a policy that elite Chinese literati who are online arguing about this kind of stuff think is important. But if you said Eldridge Colby to like 99% of Chinese people, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I have no idea who that is.
Mhm.
Rubio is interesting because, and I think for the people who know what he stands for, because as soon as he was appointed, his rhetoric like turned around.
Right.
Basically, he was so anti-China, and then he got his position, and he got much more nuanced really suddenly, and I think that
Yeah.
surprised a lot of people.
Yeah, honestly, and I noticed that as well because, if you went to Marco Rubio's tweets or anything, I mean, he was just a rabid hawk at all times. and it was always, mainly focused to China. But I was kind of taken back, and I want your thoughts as well. That one of the first things that Trump said as president elect was, hey, I just got off the phone with Z, and we talked about the fentanyl crisis, TikTok, and all this stuff. And I think we're gonna like get along really well. And like to me, that was a huge weight off my shoulders. And I think this is kind of the way that Trump operates. That generally he's a little less hawkish than his administration, but the problem is he's such a pushover that all it takes is somebody just going like that to him, and he's like, "All right, yeah, screw it, we'll bomb Beijing."
It's interesting because it does look like Trump does maintain good relationships with all kinds of people, even
Yeah.
people that he gets adversarial in other ways. So just because he has an excellent relationship with someone with whom he is playing chess doesn't mean he's not trying to win the game. So I think, if you look at pictures dating back to his first presidency, there's tons of pictures of Trump and Melania and President Xi and his wife walking around the Forbidden City, and they're just having a great time, smiling and posing with kids and like posing with backgrounds that are famous ancient architecture, and they just look like two buddies, two families that are getting along well. But then of course you have the trade war. So I don't think we can gauge how Trump is going to approach China by the degree to which he's buddies with President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement. And it's funny, and I'm sure you notice this as well, where basically you can never get like an objective view on Trump from honestly, I hate to say it, but anybody, because the people who like him, everything that he says that they agree with, he's being honest and straightforward about. But everything that he says that they don't like, he's lying or he's playing 4D chess or something like that. And I think, and this is another topic I wanted to cover with you, particularly when it comes to the stuff surrounding Israel. And where it's saying we're going to occupy Gaza, even though now he's doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on it. Um, that's just a 4D chess move. But though, saying that we're going to blow Iran to smithereens is just, that's him lying or something like that. Like all the bad stuff is just a lie. But then, the ceasefire, that's the greatest thing that ever happened. So what do, the Chinese culture generally kind of feel about, the wars over the last couple of years, particularly Ukraine and Russia, and then Gaza as well? Because I know this was a lot under Biden, so I'm kind of curious, like how people generally view the dichotomy between Biden over the last couple of years and now Trump.
Well, Ukraine is interesting because if you ask different Chinese people, you're going to get very different answers.
Hmm,
And so I don't think we can actually say Chinese people think X about Ukraine.
sure.
Because if you ask different people, it's not just, oh, I'm pro Russia or I'm pro Ukraine. It's much more nuanced. It's like the same kind of answers you would get from asking a crowd of American people. The official position of the Chinese government is that the war should end. There should be peace immediately, and war is bad. And they don't support either side. Actually, right up until the beginning of the war, when it started, China was sending relief aid to support wounded soldiers on both sides. There was food
Hmm,
aid coming from the organization called CIDCA, which is China's kind of US aid, but it doesn't do interference in other countries.
sure.
Different kind of, it actually sends aid. So it was
It's
sending
not, yeah,
aid.
it's not propaganda networks.
Yeah, it was sending aid to Ukraine and it was sending aid to Russia. And if you look at China's policies, the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the giant global initiatives that China has launched that people know about. Ukraine is a part of it and Russia's a part of it.
Hmm,
And there's still part of it. So the Belt and Road Initiative didn't even go away. A lot of the projects in Ukraine that were working on development projects, to build different kinds of infrastructure up until when the war started were part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so that is also true of Russia. So China's official position is to not interfere in the internal politics of other nations. So it doesn't attempt to interfere with Russia. It doesn't attempt to interfere with Ukraine. It wants trade with both countries, and it just wants to see the war end. And I think that's why Trump has already said, hey, China, could you help us, create a peace scenario here? Because China is actually a pretty good arbiter in terms of like, it doesn't really seem to take sides. There are politicians in the United States saying because China is trading with Russia that it is supporting Russia. But
right.
that's ludicrous. That's just like that's rhetoric and politics. But China is equally trading with Ukraine at the same time. If Ukraine wanted to import and export with China, China would have no problem with that. China is just open for business. That's its official policy, that it does not interfere in the internal politics of other countries. Now, Gaza is an interesting one. It's a little bit different because Russia still maintains trade with Israel and wants to have trade with Palestine. And it did provide aid for Gaza and it did provide aid for Israel. So, but the official position is that Gaza is for the Palestinian people.
Mm-hmm.
And China has reemphasized that. President Xi Jinping has reemphasized that, especially after Trump made his articulation that he wants to create a Riviera in the Middle East. President Xi Jinping came out and said, Gaza is for the Palestinian people. This is their land. And so even though China is not really taking sides, it is articulating, along with the United Nations, that this land specifically does belong to the people of Palestine. And I think China would not like to see them taken out and put somewhere else under circumstances unknown and then have like a Trump Tower put there. It's a little bizarre, I think.
Yeah. So one thing that I kind of wanted to go back to was actually Ukraine, because you mentioned that people are a little bit mixed about it. And I kind of had this. It's maybe not a hypothesis, but it seems pretty reasonable to me. And I think I can't remember exactly where I read something about this, but people had called Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe, if I remember correctly. And my understanding is, and you can correct me if I am mistaken, but China imports, I think it's $3 or $9 billion of food from America per year because a lot of China is deserts, so they don't have nearly as much farmland as the U.S. has, right? And that's also part of the reason why China, back in what was it, 2014, bought Smithfield, and that's where people make the outrageous claims that China's buying all the farmland, even though when you look into it, they owe less than a fraction of 1% of overall farmland here in the United States. But the overall point is that it seems to be in the Chinese government's interests to actually end the war in Ukraine because that's where they can get a lot of grain. Does that make sense to you? And have you heard anything else?
It is an interesting topic. China is actually trying to become self-sufficient in agricultural goods, but it also has a problem that is slightly unrelated in that it exports, in terms of value, more than it imports from most countries around the world, not all. And so one of the things China tries to do is import more agricultural goods from other nations to maintain a better trade balance so that other countries are not upset with the degree to which China is exporting goods to them. And so China could easily switch from Ukraine and get like agricultural goods from Brazil or the United States if it really wanted to. Mm-hmm. And it could make up for all of that with Brazil, and Brazil would be like laughing to the bank. Mm-hmm. China imports agricultural goods from the Ukraine and the United States. And it's not just because it needs them. It does it because it's trying to make the terms of import-export trade more favorable for the Ukraine and the United States so that neither of them get upset with the degree to which Americans and Ukrainians are importing Chinese goods. Like, for example, the United States runs a massive trade deficit with China, meaning that you guys buy tons of stuff at Walmart that China makes, right? But China is not buying as much stuff from the United States because the United States doesn't manufacture that much. So one of the things that China does is, import, okay, you know what? We'll just import like several billion more dollars of like soybeans or something, just so that they can have a more favorable trade balance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that kind of brings up another point, the tariffs. So this has been, as Trump says now, his favorite word is the word tariff when he was on the Joe Rogan Experience, which just to me is laughable. Now, I'm not entirely against tariffs when you have an industrial base and you can kind of afford to be self-sufficient. But as you kind of just mentioned there, America doesn't make anything anymore, right? I mean, I live, once again, in the general Pittsburgh area, right? Southwestern Pennsylvania, which is known for being Steel City, right? I mean, I could go out on my front porch right now and look over the valley and see a steel mill right down there where I grew up as a little kid. There, I remember walking out of the house and looking to the left, and they had a big old factory right there. So, I mean, there's steel mills and just, union mills everywhere around here, but a lot of them don't really produce that much anymore because, I think it's largely from the U.S. government cranking down on regulations and then telling people that, hey, we're not going to produce this anymore. And then obviously, China looked at that and said, hey, this is an opportunity for us to really increase, our overall prosperity as a country. And people look at it as like some kind of sinister ploy to ship all the jobs off to China. No, it just made sense at the time. But, it was also, once again, bureaucrats telling people that they can't really do business for, in the way that they would seek to do it. So how is China handling this whole trade war and tariff situation? I do have a follow-up to this after, you give your answer.
There's a famous professor, I think she teaches at Harvard. I haven't double checked that, Kai Eugene, but I've watched her give several speeches, and she's talked, along with several other economists that I follow, that China has been preparing since 2018 or so, when the first tariff war really started to bite. And if you look at the numbers, China since then has transformed its export emphasis to a global emphasis on the developing world. Basically, the Belt and Road Initiative members, if you look at it, it's all of South America, most of Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, so all of these parts of the world who are outside of the G7, they comprise a larger part of China's export portfolio. China exports more to the developing world than the United States and Europe combined now. And I think exports to the United States are roughly 11% of China's total exports. And as a percentage of China's total economy, it's about 2%, might be like 2.3%. Mm-hmm. So if tariffs take a small part of that and reduce it a little bit, it's really not going to affect China that much. So I don't think I also don't think Trump is really thinking, I want to hurt China. Actually, I don't think that's what his game is. I think he wants to erect these high walls, and that's why he's tariffing everyone right now. And he there's an idea that he has where he even said this recently. His favorite time in the United States was before 1913. And at that time, there were no income taxes. And this is a huge thing for Republicans, if you remember. And it's all through my entire life is income tax. At that time, the United States completely funded itself through tariffs. And there was no income tax on anyone. And so I think Trump's thinking is we'll have huge tariffs. Those will pay the Treasury. Will reduce taxes for people of all classes. This is just this. I'm not saying I'm for this. I'm not going to say my position, but this is definitely what he wants. And then he thinks that this will bring back manufacturing to the United States. If I might just add one thing, I think there is a flaw there. This doesn't reflect on China as much as this policy that he's trying to implement in the United States. Even if the United States, because all imports became more expensive, did manufacture more, it still wouldn't be able to export as much because it would still be more affordable to manufacture in India or China or Bangladesh or Vietnam or Mexico. So yes, it's possible to bring some manufacturing back a little bit, but not to the degree which I think he's hoping, because no one's going to buy something at $10 when they can get it at $2.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny because you still hear people throw out the trope of, oh, cheap Chinese garbage. It's like, well, that might have been true decades ago. But at this point, I mean,
this is my Xiaomi watch. It stays charged for 2 weeks. It talks to my phone. It talks to my computer. It does all the blood pressure and all that stuff, timers and stuff. But it also takes phone calls. It has its own independent phone. This is my Xiaomi phone, but this has its own phone number, and I could leave my phone at home. It's not tethered to it, and I could take calls like Inspector Gadget in the 1980s.
Yeah. So it's funny because I wear my Samsung. I wear my Samsung, and I have to charge it twice a day, and I would have to pay. My wife shut off the service on it because we just didn't need it, but I want to say it was probably like 10 or 20 bucks a month to have service on this. And once again, it still does all the same stuff that yours does, but the battery life lasts maybe 10 hours if I'm lucky.
But Samsung, a Korean company, manufactures in China. So, I mean,
yeah,
there's that.
Right. Yeah, of course. The follow-up that I wanted to throw to you is that people always bring this up. They always say, oh, well, China has tariffs too.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, most of China's tariffs are a tit-for-tat response to the original Trump tariffs. So most of China's Trump tariffs that are like edging at WTO, like borderline issues, are a response to tariffs from the United States. So
Mm,
both countries have escalated. The United States goes, China adds. The United States goes, China adds. Each time it's been retaliatory. I've been watching the news very carefully.
mm,
If the United States sat down, a delegation from the United States and a delegation from China sat down, they could walk them back if both sides wanted to do that. But the
yeah.
thing is, while China actually, I think they do, I don't think the United States does. The United States does not want. And another example of how China is moving away from tariffs, there is an event last year, 2024. It happens every few years, called FOCAC. And it is when all of these African countries come to Beijing, and then they talk about trade deals and development and building bridges and hospitals and schools and so forth and ports. China dropped all tariffs to zero on all products for the 50 least wealthy countries in the world, which included
Mm,
most of the countries in Africa, but also some countries
wow.
in Southeast Asia and Nepal, for example, in South Asia. And
Mhm,
so, if Nepal or Sudan wanted to export anything, coffee beans or whatever it is that they're producing to China, zero tariffs. So this is something, China is actually opening up while the United States is closing off. So the United
mm,
States is moving away from free trade and calling it globalism, and China is moving towards free trade and
mhm,
calling it the Belt and Road Initiative. So,
mhm,
it's that the United States wants tariffs. It's not really that China doesn't really want to have a tariff war.
mhm. Right. So this kind of goes to another thing as well that I'm really curious about. Um, some of my more right-leaning friends who are very, very pro-Trump are very excited about the aspects of the way that Trump and his administration are talking about South America, right? Where, we've had sanctions, the US that is, has had sanctions on, I think it's, what is it, a third of the world's population, and particularly some of the most brutal sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and some other, Honduras, countries down there in the Latin America. Now, some of them are saying like, oh, well, this is because, basically the Monroe Doctrine, where we're supposed to have influence on our own sphere. And I can't help but always kind of come back to think like, okay, well, China's influence over Latin America isn't insanely strong. Like, I'm sure they have some influence and obviously they trade with them. But my thinking has been like, why don't we take all those sanctions off? Why don't we stop trying to coup those countries down there? Because that did happen under Trump, where they sent 4 American soldiers down to Venezuela and recognized Juan Guaido as the official president, even though that was a failed coup. Why not give them more preferential treatment in trade and maybe, visas or something like that? And not cause all their people to flee due to brutal sanctions. And then maybe we can have that Monroe Doctrine and not have to worry about China gaining influence because we're giving them a better deal. But maybe I'm just crazy.
I think that is brilliant. Actually, I never really thought of it in that way, but now that you say that, I want to read something. I know that this is
Good.
not
Yeah.
normal. I've never done this in an interview, but I literally
Oh,
read this
good.
this morning, and I'm going to
Okay.
keep it brief. I'm not going to read a lot. This is from the Tao Te Ching. I
Okay.
read a little bit of it every day, and it talks about international politics in exactly the way that you refined it. I'm going
Hmm.
to skip over some parts. It says, if a
Okay.
great country can lower itself before a small country, it will win over the small country. And so actually that's
Uh,
what you're talking about. If the
yes,
United
actually.
States were to say, hey, you know what, Venezuela, we don't care what government you have whatever government you want. We want trade with you. We want to have great relations with you. We're going to end all sanctions on you, and we want to import oil from you, and we're going to refine it in the United States. We're all going to make a lot of money. I
Mhm.
think you're right. I think Venezuelans would suddenly love the United States, and that's
Right.
essentially what China is doing. The leaders of the Communist Party of China, they read this,
Mhm.
and they read Sun Tzu. They read all of this ancient Chinese philosophy, which is talking about what you're talking about. Hey, let's not put pressure on other countries. Let's be humble before them. Have you ever seen the parades that get put on for a really small country with like a population of 1 million? They show up in Beijing, there's helicopters flying over, soldiers are lined up saluting the president or prime minister of that country. They give them so much face. This is a huge term in
Mm.
China, face. They give them so much face in China. These little countries, they give them so much respect. And the United States goes around the world trying to overthrow governments, and then they're like, why don't people like us? Like, I think you're right. If the United States were to like treat Latin American countries with respect and value their internal sovereignty, the sky's the limit about how much those countries would love the United States. I think you're right. I think the United States has gone a wrong way in terms of just kind of arrogantly dealing with other countries around the world. And if our foreign policy were to reflect more respect for the internal choices of those nations, the United States would receive a lot more love and respect from those nations. They're one of the reasons African countries like China so much. I'm actually writing a second book. One book is being processed by a huge Chinese publishing company. I'm writing a second book about this. China goes through Africa building hospitals. Here you go. Here's 2 hospitals. Here's another hospital. Here's an elementary school. Here's a bridge. And it costs China a lot. It does. But those countries have preferential trade deals with China now, because they're like, oh my gosh, China just built us 2 hospitals, 3 bridges, and 2 schools. Like, who do we want to trade with? Who do you think they want to trade with?
Yeah, to me, it seems completely obvious, but for some reason, our leaders never look at it that way. And to me, it's just absolutely insane. And there was a little bit of hope initially where, they kind of went down there and, greeted them. And then all of a sudden, a week later, I think it was Marco Rubio who went down to Venezuela. And then a week later, he was like, they were seizing helicopters off of Venezuela. I'm like, all right, well, there goes diplomacy. And, to kind of keep on the rail Venezuela there, I had Anya Parampil on a while back, and she had made the point to me that like the U.S. and Venezuela's foundings are like very, 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 very similar. And also, Venezuela is also one of the most oil-rich countries in the world. I think they're like second next to Saudi Arabia. So, like, if we want cheaper energy prices, which what have people bitched about over the last couple of years? Energy prices. Well, I mean, we have a country right down there that we tried to coup. Why don't we say, hey, our bad, man, we're going to take sanctions off you. Why don't you give us some of that oil and we'll give you, we'll figure something out, right? We'll trade with you more in a more beneficial way. And let's kind of work this thing out because, hey, maybe we got off on a bad foot. Let's kind of repair relations here. But, to bring it back to China, it really does seem like they've kind of been like, hey, we're willing to lose money, but if it means that we'll gain reputation and respect in return, we think that's a worthy trade. Whereas the U.S. says, we'll drop bombs on you and we'll wonder why we don't get any respect in return.
I think you're absolutely right. China has not invaded or had a major war in more than 4 decades. So the United States, it's ongoing. It's like how many in any given year since the year 2000. If the question hasn't been is the United States in a war, it's how many wars. And
Right.
if we want the rest of the world to look favorably upon the United States, we need to change the way that we conduct our foreign policy. It's in the United States' best interest to change our foreign policy to one that is more respectful to nations around the world and allow them to have their own internal systems. And I think it's actually scientifically interesting and economically interesting to allow 200 countries to all have their own economic system, not to say, oh, you know what, our democratic system with 2 parliaments or whatever is the one you should have, and we're going to force that on you, and this is how you should conduct your trade, which is what the WTO does. I think it would be much better to just say, you try that. Let's see how that works out for you. And then we can learn from the economic systems that they try. I mean, there's no reason that the United States should go around the world forcing our idea of how to govern a country on all of these other smaller countries.
Mm-hmm. Right. And specifically because, a people and how they choose to be dictated is going to be different according to each people. And, the way that we've kind of constructed the world in most governments is that people get to decide the government that they want to live under. And I'm not saying that it's always right, it's not always just, but unfortunately that's kind of the way of the world. So it is wrong for us to decide like, oh no, this country has to run this way, this country has to work that way, because once again, maybe in different areas these different systems don't work. So one other thing I wanted to go to, I'm pretty sure he's a mutual friend of ours. Nico House had said on his show a couple days ago, or maybe it might have been a couple weeks ago, where he's like, okay, on the left, we need to have a conversation about China. And I don't consider myself to be a part of the left, but I thought it was an interesting perspective. He's like, the words aren't matching the actions. And he was bringing up how China is sort of condemning the way that Israel's treating the Palestinians. And really, anybody who's been paying attention, I don't think your response should be any different. I mean, it's obvious that what they're doing there is a genocidal war by the definition, right? But, they're still trading with China rather than, perhaps putting pressure on them to get peace. So, what's kind of your perspective on that? And do you think that China could perhaps put some pressure on Israel to maybe, um, bring a little bit more, or, maybe treat the Palestinians better, or, lay off the bombing and bring a little bit more peace to that conflict?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I just want to point out before I do a little bit of analysis on this
Sure.
is that China is not providing Israel any kinds of weapons of any
Mhm.
kind at all, in any way whatsoever. All of the weapons are coming from the UK, Germany, the United States.
Mhm.
So all of the weapons that Israel is using for its crimes against humanity there are none of them are coming from China. China does trade with Israel. China has, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, and like it or not, this remains true for everyone. When we're talking about Ukraine and Russia, same deal. Open for business. We'll trade with anyone. We're not going to micromanage other countries unless it's directly affecting the sovereignty of China itself. They're
Mhm.
not going to interfere in other countries and their affairs and their ongoing. And this is one of the things the United States does. And I think that I've talked to other people from the Revolutionary Black Network and other shows that I've been interviewed on about this, and they were also frustrated with this. United States paradigm, its international political science paradigm is we will put pressure on other nations. We will use sanctions. We will use tariffs. We will use,
Mhm.
diplomatic pressure to make them behave internationally the way that we, the United States, would like them to behave. This is why the United States has sanctions on Venezuela. It's why
Mhm.
the United States has sanctions on North Korea. It's why the United States has sanctions on Cuba, on countries all over the world. Afghanistan now and Iraq before, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. Just the sanctions between the two Gulf wars. China does not follow that policy. China does not interfere in other nations. It's just like in the war in Europe. It would trade with Ukraine. It trades with Russia, and Israel is committing crimes against humanity, and that's what the ICJ says. That's what the ICC says. But China is not going to use its economic system and its trade for punitive measures against other nations. It's just
Mhm.
not going to do that because it has a firm national policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations.
Mhm.
So, yes, China could stop trading with Israel, but it doesn't have that kind of foreign policy, and that's also a strength of China's in that it will not manipulate other countries through this pressure system that has been used by the United States, that Americans are so used to the United States doing that they expect that China would do that too. But
Mhm.
that's not the way that China operates.
Mhm. One thing that I had received pushback on, I'm really, really curious, your kind of thoughts on this. A friend of mine and I were kind of having a back and forth about more of, kind of this Monroe Doctrinist perspective. And he was arguing that, yes, China is expansive because look at what they're doing in South Africa. That should be the United States doing this. And that they have spies in the Canadian government. And that there, and another friend had mentioned there's, all these, officials in the Canadian government are paid off by the CCP or CPC. Obviously, everybody who says CCP, they don't know the lingo. But there's that, and then we also hear that there's all these Chinese spies coming over here to the universities, and it's funny because they throw these people out and they find out they're actually Americans, and you completely ruin people's lives over baseless
Mhm.
accusations.
Mhm.
But what is your perspective, and is there any truth to this idea that there are just Chinese spies absolutely everywhere, all over the world, expanding China's influence into all these governments?
That is such a complex question.
Okay.
I'm going to try to keep this brief because I don't want to bore people. But
Sure.
during the French Revolution, before the French Revolution under King Louis XVI, there weren't an enormous amount of spies, just maybe a
Mhm.
few hundred that the king operated throughout the country. But within 5 years, supposedly there were tens of thousands of spies just in Paris alone. So something about transitioning to a republic creates networks of spies, because all of these different politically interested people then suddenly have interlocutors and people everywhere operating in some capacity. Before I knew much anything about China, and I was living in the United States, and we obviously have a lot of spy movies. I
Mhm.
was always thinking, whatever I say, the CIA is listening, the NSA is listening, probably MI5 or MI6 are also listening, probably Pepsi's listening. Honestly, to whatever I say at any given time, there's probably like 100 governments that know what I'm doing and saying, and there's probably 100 corporations like Facebook that know what I'm doing and saying. So
Mhm.
just don't do anything bad, right? Don't be like an insane person and like a threat to society, and you probably
Right.
be okay. Then I moved to China. I don't think that has changed. I think probably yes, China, the United States, the UK, France, Venezuela, they probably do have spies all over the place. But the
Mhm.
reality is, the students in U.S. universities are just students, and I'm going to tell you why the FBI is making a huge mistake about this, and that you know there are 95 million members of the CPC, the Communist Party of China, in China. So anyone in China has a family member or a friend who is a member of the Communist Party of China in China. So
Right.
anyone, whether they're a CPC member or not, in the United States who is a student, the FBI is going to be able to find some tenuous link to the
Mhm.
CPC, right? Because
Right.
there's just so many. It's like saying it's like the China were to say anyone with connections to the Democratic Party is a threat to China. And so then they look at all the Americans and they all have some friend who's a member of the Democratic Party. It
Right.
makes no sense to think like that. So I
Yeah.
think that these career professors and scientists in the United States that are being crucified by the FBI and having their lives overturned and destroyed, it's not just bad because the logic is wrong, but it's also bad because of STEM research in the United States is probably the most critical thing in the United States. Most people probably don't know that. But wherever
Mhm.
scientists go, that's where economics goes.
Mhm.
There was a huge economy in Germany 100 years ago. It moved to France, it moved to the UK, and it moved to the United States, and now it's moving to China. Why? Because that's where the scientists are going. All of these Chinese scientists who filled professorial positions and research positions in the United States are now terrified of living in the United States under this McCarthyist system, where just
Mhm.
because they have some Chinese background, they're going to be persecuted. So some of the greatest minds in some of the greatest fields are leaving the United States and coming to China and teaching at Chinese universities and researching in China. And China is now pulling ahead in science. Who would have thought that if all of the great scientists moved to China, that China would be better at science? So the
Mhm.
FBI really needs to just stop this McCarthyist scare stuff and realize that the United States priority should be having great scientists in the United States, whether they're from the United States, whether they're from China, whether they're from India or elsewhere.
Mhm.
They should be courting these scientists desperately in the United States. We should be hoping that they come to the United States to research there instead of scaring them away.
All right, we're going to take a second today to chill and tell you about the show's sponsors, Tiger Fitness. Make sure you go to the link below to get all the supplements that I use day in, day out, and beyond. As I always say, you do not need supplements to become all jacked and tan or to progress in your health journey, but they could definitely be a useful tool in that respect. So, as you can see on tigerfitness.com, we got MTS Nutrition, Blackstone Labs, Ambrosia, HPN, Nutrix Research, America Labs, Alani New, Pump Chasers, there's Redcon One, Accent Sledge, plenty of different companies that pretty much have absolutely any supplement you could possibly think of: pre workouts, fat burners, BCAAs, electrolyte mixes, you name it, it's on there. So go to Tiger Fitness through the link below. Use code Kyle at checkout to let them know that I sent you. Get your protein powder, you name it, anything that's going to help you stick to your diet and hopefully achieve your health goals. All right, thanks. Back to the show. I agree. I agree completely. So the other thing that you kind of slightly touch on there was kind of like the labor moving to China. So I never really bothered to look into this until about a week or two ago when people always bring up slave labor in China, right? And surely enough, you and I talked about this on the last show. So please, anybody, if you're listening to this right now, please refer to the last show because we talked about the Xinjiang region. And, I've done plenty of shows on this now at this point. Every single one, every single time you mention slave labor in China, what's the region? The Xinjiang region. That's always where all the slave labor is happening, where there's an alleged genocide, where my understanding is that's actually where the Belt and Road Initiative would be finished and they would get a lot of gas and oil resources from Africa, is where that, that would all be finished right there. So it's in the US's interests, at least my understanding is it's in the US interest to cause disarray and chaos in that area. And, there were also some Uyghur Muslims that were trained by the CIA in Syria to, help try to overthrow the regime there. So it's in the US's interest to cause chaos in this area because, once again, this, sticks their finger in the face of China. So, is there any truth to this day about the slave labor claims in China? And the other thing I want to touch on, well, you know what? Let's cover the slave labor, and then I want to follow up with something else.
There's so much I could say about this. I'm going to try to only talk about me personally, although I could say a lot more. I've been there several times, and I've actually physically gone to. So, okay, the big one for a while was cotton. Okay, cotton pickers are slaves. They're Uyghur slaves that are picking cotton. I went to the cotton fields and drove around several days, stopping off at various cotton fields. 90% of the work being done there is machines. And I've made videos and I've posted them on my Twitter for people who want to look. I think, what is it called? Highlights. You can go scroll down my highlights. It's not that far. You can see my video of standing in the cotton fields of Xinjiang, and behind me are these giant machines rolling across. And we interviewed and I talked to the actual cotton pickers who come later after they get 95% of the cotton. Some people come, they were making huge amounts of money. They're just making money. It's profitability for these farmers that work out there. There were no cops or sentries of any kind or police cars or vans sitting around anywhere that we went. There was nothing like that at all. And I've been to several cities across Xinjiang. I've not just gone to Kashgar. I've gone to, I don't know, 24 cities in Xinjiang, and Uyghurs are just walking around. You would imagine if there were 2 to 3 million, that's what Zenz says, 2 to 3 million Uyghurs locked up, that if you went to a Uyghur dense city, you wouldn't see people our age, people of military age, especially males, right? That's what you expect. People from like 16 to 45, male, you wouldn't see them, but they're everywhere. They're playing basketball. They're like eating. They're walking around. They're speaking Uyghur. They're in modern clothes. They're in traditional clothes. They're at mosques that are open and they can practice. There is registration if you want to practice at a mosque, and this is true. I want to be completely fair. If you want to be a practicing Muslim who attends mosque, you need to register and write your name down when you enter the mosque. So yes, there is some surveillance because there were massive terrorist events about 10 years ago. The United States dealt with terrorism by killing millions of people in Iraq and Afghanistan. China dealt with terrorism by providing technical training centers, giving people jobs, improving the economy, and it's amazing. The per capita income in Xinjiang has risen faster in Xinjiang than any other part of China. So like China put a huge emphasis on, well, what's causing this? Maybe there's some stress on people. Let's de-stress them by improving their economy. So tons of companies and the government SOEs went in there. They developed, they built factories, they provided jobs, and it is one of the most flourishing parts of Western China now. So it's also, there's a misconception that it's just Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that this what are they called? The East Turkestan movement started by the CIA should give this whole part of them to this CIA organization. But that is so misleading. You go to some parts of Xinjiang, there are no Uyghur people there. There are Hui people or Kazakh people or Turkmen people. And also there's another part, I'm going to just finish. This is the last thing I'm going to say on this.
Of course.
I know that we want to get to other things, but Uyghur language is being erased. No, I went to an elementary school there, and they were teaching Uyghur and Chinese, Mandarin. So they're learning both. And if you look at signs, and I've made videos about this, you can go to my Twitter and you can look at the feed under highlights. I have made videos where I show signs and, medicine bottles and Pepsi Cola bottles or whatever. All of it's bilingual in Chinese and Uyghur. You can look at the signs as you're walking around. You arrive at the airport, arrive at the train station, or go to a shop and buy stuff, and there's bread with both languages on it. People are speaking Chinese Mandarin. They're speaking Chinese Uyghur on the streets everywhere. There's no disappearance of culture. There's no disappearance of language. There's all of the accusations are absolutely ludicrous. The United States was hoping to create a massive disturbance there, and China did one better than the United States. Instead of massive persecution, they did the opposite, massive economic benefits.
Mhm. Yeah, and like I said, we've covered that before on the show plenty of times. I had Ken Hammond on a couple weeks ago, and we talked about this a little bit as well. So the other thing that gets leveled at China a lot, and I looked into this, and there did seem to be some truth to Foxconn, which was a where they were building iPhones back in 2010 or 11. I want to say, or it might have been 2010, where this is where everybody went buck wild with the claims that there are suicide nets hanging off the buildings and stuff because
There were.
um yes there were,
Yes,
and it
there
said
were.
that there were 10 people that had committed suicide, but I want to put the caveat on this, and I want you to give your thoughts and tell me if what I'm thinking is correct. This was also very, very, shortly after the 2008 financial crisis, which I have to imagine this is back when China probably wasn't as prosperous as it is now. So this was about 15 years ago. This was shortly after the financial crisis, and 10 people who might have been at the end of their rope committed suicide in a Foxconn factory, which is funny enough, a Taiwanese company, which when you start to consider the foreign policy implications of this and kind of the way that the US wants to shape this, and it's all US based outlets that reported this, you kind of have to take that in context. So I don't know the whole truth of that situation. I don't think anybody does other than the people who work there. But what's your impression of that? And what's the explanation as you know it?
Were there people that attempted suicide at a factory in China? Yes. I think you use the word context. I think when we think about China, we need to, and this I think want to actually make a wider argument here.
Sure.
When we talk of there's a few people who make YouTube videos that are very famous, and they like to point out violent events that happen in China, where someone like stabbed a bunch of people or whatever. Did that happen? Yeah, it happened. Absolutely happened. I'm not going to deny that at all. But you have to look at the statistical probability of these things, because it's easy if we go into the United States to find fentanyl overdoses and cocaine overdoses and all this stuff. Is that what America's like? Is America just a series of overdoses? No. So if we want to cherry pick like the worst parts of a society and then try to say, oh man, China, there was a stabbing event in Yunnan. There's just stabbing events all over China. It's an insane proposition. And if you actually look at I'll come back to suicide. If you look at violence in China, actually someone is, I think, 13 times less likely to be involved in a violent homicide in China as they are in the United States. Does that mean the United States is just a horrible, violent place and you should not go there? No. Just because the United States has 13 times as many violent events, if I wanted to go back or my wife wanted to go, I would say, yeah, go have a great time, go to Vegas, whatever. I don't think that she's going to be stabbed or shot. It's very statistically improbable, despite the fact that there's much more violence. So if you want to look at suicides in China, have there been suicides? Are there suicides? Are there going to be suicides in 2025? Yes. Are those representative of Chinese society, and is that what Chinese society is like?
Right.
No. There were particular problems at the Foxconn factory managed by Taiwan, which was doing orders for Apple. Yes, that's true. I think they've improved the situation dramatically, and workers' rights are better. And actually, there's a lot more automation too. So, is China now in 2025 the same as it was in 2010? No, but also we just like you use the word context. We need to always put these things in context, because when there's a shooting at a school in the United States, yes, that is problematic, but it doesn't represent what daily life for students is in the United States either.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very, very important point, and I'm glad you kind of zoomed out and pointed that out because I really wasn't thinking about it in that respect. But if you talk to at least anybody that I know personally when it comes to China, they all, if you mention like the slave labor in China, they instantly bring that up. Oh, there's slave labor there. There's, there's kids being paid $2 a day to build Nikes, and you want to have your Apple
I
phone.
don't think so.
Yeah, I wish I had the clip up, but if you're familiar with Tim Pool, and if you're not, God bless you, because just keep it that way. But him and Brad Palumbo were going back and forth on this, and he got fierce with it. He said to Brad that you're willing to accept a certain amount of human sacrifice so you can have an iPhone, because iPhones are made at the Foxconn factory in China. And I'm like, wow, you want to talk about straight up, CIA deep state propaganda about China. I mean, you could not get any more accurate than that. Like, geez, man.
Well, I think that we've also seen this turn, the discourses turn. Before it was people who hate China abroad, maybe with some CIA backing. I don't know. There's no way to prove that. And people who were defending China, mostly foreigners in China and Chinese people living in the West, saying, "Oh no, that's not true." And a lot of the trolls underneath would be for like the propaganda against China. But actually, after the Xiaohongshu revolution and millions of Americans becoming friends with millions of Chinese people,
yeah,
actually the comments have turned the other way, and it's now like, oh, that we were lied to, and now we see that China's just like anywhere else.
Yeah, and that really seemed to be the way it was, and it was kind of funny because there were a lot of people from Chinese culture that, to my understanding, really didn't like Israel. I'm like, man, that really makes me respect their culture a lot more. So, you kind of brought up, I don't want to butcher the pronouncing of it, but Red Note, right?
Sure.
However, you pronounce it in how they say it in China. This kind of goes to the conversation of TikTok. So I did a whole podcast on TikTok, but the common refrain here is, oh, well, it's banned in China, and the algorithms here are set by China to show our children all this degeneracy and poison their minds, or as Tom Cotton would say, it's digital fentanyl. Okay, so what's the deal with TikTok when it comes to China from your perspective?
I think, there's a term that we used to use in my generation. I'm a very old person, actually, with a very young face. I'm almost 50. When in the 1980s, we used to say garbage in, garbage out. Mostly that was referring to people. If they're going to consume a bunch of garbage media, they're going to kind of become a garbage person. And that was like an insult to say to someone. I think TikTok has wonderful. I actually don't see a lot of terrible stuff. I'm on TikTok. I have 1.4 million fans on TikTok.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I love TikTok, and I go on there all the time. I actually don't see any weird, crazy stuff, actually, because
You live in China, right?
No, I'm talking about U.S. TikTok. I'm on Douyin too.
Okay.
I'm on Chinese Douyin.
Yeah. They always bring up the China ban TikTok.
Well, I want to point out the way algorithms work. So if you're on Instagram and you look at cars, right? You love cars, you're going to see cars. If you love guitars like you do, you're going to see guitars and rock band stuff, right? And if you switch your behavior on Instagram for a week or two, what it feeds you becomes the new thing that you're interested in. Actually, I think Instagram has a wonderful algorithm, because whatever I'm no longer interested slowly disappears. And I think that's great. And TikTok does the same thing. I use TikTok a lot. I don't see violent images or images of children doing those challenges where they stand on a bunch of crates and fall down and hurt themselves. I don't see that stuff. Why? Because I'm not out there looking for that. So I'm looking for like stuff that's related to like technology and science and maybe China stuff. So that's what it feeds me. So I think like when people say, oh my gosh, my kids are looking at all of these dangerous behaviors of teenagers trying these weird challenges, you should sit down with your teenage son or daughter and talk to them about how these behaviors are unsafe and get them interested in something else, because the algorithm is feeding them whatever it is that they're looking for. And that's just what teenagers were looking for at the time. I really don't think China's out there like, let's get all the teenagers in America to stand on as many crates as they can stack high and see how many of them hurt themselves. That is insane.
Yeah, and one other thing that's always been very fun to me is that people will share a video off of TikTok and say, look at this TikTok. This is telling you how bad the Chinese government is. I'm like, think about what you just said there for a second. Like, just think for a second. And one thing I want to point out here is also that the owner of ByteDance is actually Singaporean. When he was getting grilled amongst all the Congress and the Senate, they were screaming at him, and he kept telling them, I'm from Singapore. I'm Singaporean. And, kind of like you were saying earlier, does he have some, maybe a girlfriend, maybe a long lost second cousin that's a member of the CPC? Probably does. Does that mean that he's feeding all this information that people willingly, keyword here, willingly give to TikTok? Is he feeding all that information to the CPC? No. And once again,
interesting. I just want to add a couple pieces of tiny bits of context. Their servers are in Texas.
Yes, Oracle.
TikTok US services are in Texas in the United States. If the CIA detected some kind of transfer of mass amounts of American data from those servers, it would be headline news in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Everyone would
Right.
be like, oh my gosh, this was a Facebook Analytica moment for TikTok or something.
Mhm.
It never happened. And if you actually look, and you can Google this, as ex CIA operatives work at TikTok in the United States. It's like at least 3 dozen of them working there, helping manage the algorithm. So the United States has its hands deep, its tentacles deep, whatever term you want to use, deep
Yeah.
into TikTok. This isn't about China. This is about the United States, or specific corporations and political interests want to take over the app because it's so powerful, it's so valuable. They want to profit from it and control it.
Mhm.
It has nothing to do with China at all, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned how they call TikTok digital fentanyl, and this is another thing that gets leveled at China a lot. And I've done my debunking on this. I don't know if I no, you know, me and my buddy Pat talked about this a long time ago, but I'm curious how you see this, how you would be able to explain it. The accusation is always leveled at China that they're sending their fentanyl over here to poison Americans through the Mexican drug cartels. What say you?
Okay, so there actually, firstly, a couple of years ago, the United States government and the Chinese government created a joint working group with scientists and politicians who get together regularly and have meetings about how the fentanyl is being shipped. Because China ships precursors, not actual fentanyl. It ships chemicals that are used in the production of fentanyl to other countries, including the United States. These get shipped to pharmaceutical companies in the United States, and US pharmaceutical companies take the precursors, the chemicals that are required to make fentanyl, and produce fentanyl. This fentanyl is then used at hospitals, especially for extremely horrendous pain, like end of death, your final moments, and gruesome cancer cases that are just horrendously painful. So it's used as a pain medicine for people who desperately need it. So China's not shipping fentanyl anywhere. I felt like that was a very Trump thing to do with my hands right there.
The
China's
invisible
not
accordion.
China is not sending fentanyl anywhere. It doesn't even make fentanyl. It makes precursors, and then pharmaceutical companies in other countries are then turning that into fentanyl and then bringing that, in some cases, across the border from Mexico to sell to Americans. Uh, Another issue: the United States leads in cocaine overdoses among all countries in the world. The United States leads in alcohol overdoses in terms of deaths of any country in the world. The United States leads in heroin overdoses in all countries in the world, and of course fentanyl too. What does this tell you? Does China produce heroin? No. Does China produce cocaine? No. Does China produce, well, they do make alcohol, but not a lot of it shipped to the United States. Very little, actually. I couldn't buy baijiu in San Francisco. My
Ah,
point is, the United States has a very serious drug pandemic, epidemic, whatever you want to call it. It's a very serious issue. And it's not because China is shipping legal precursors to American companies, which are legally buying it and producing medicine. It's because the United States has a huge, massive drug problem. And in my opinion, what the United States needs is hundreds of rehabilitation centers across the country and technical training schools. We have junior colleges in the United States. That's what we call most of our
mhm.
technical and vocational universities in the United States. We need more of that. More like train people to be mechanics, train people to be farmers, train people
Mhm.
to have jobs that the United States needs, and help them get jobs and help them get off of drugs. This is not about China. This is about a huge societal problem that America has with all kinds of drugs.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and it's not necessarily the thing that frustrates me the most when people talk about this is that they never put the blame on the user. And I'm not saying like, oh, this user's a bad person. What I'm saying is like, what are the circumstances surrounding this person feeling like they need to use this? And I think a lot of it is economic. And this really brings me to kind of what I really wanted to talk to you about today. Because I did announce on the podcast that my wife and I are expecting, and this conversation is going to be the basis as to whether or not we move to China. I'm kidding, but
Wow.
I would like to visit potentially. But so I want to read this receipt to you, and if you don't know the exact prices off the top of your head or like what it would cost, that's okay. You can always DM me afterwards, and I'll make sure I put in a little clip after this. But All right, so if you were watching this right now, here's where I'm going to cut in and show you the differences in prices on stuff that he and I bought. So as I mentioned, I went to Giant Eagle, which is a little bit pricier than your average grocery store. And if you're looking at this receipt, you could see I got bourbon barbecue beef jerky, which is $7.99, graham crackers for $3.29, and I got two little Mio. Water droplets. They're basically just like a hydration mix for your drink, and then, 2 things of sugar-free syrup. So he didn't get everything that I got because he said he couldn't find some of this stuff, but, as you can see, the total was 28.78, and I censored out everything so that way you guys don't harass that Giant Eagle store because I know how you heathens are. So let me move over to how much this would be in the Chinese RMB over here. So that would be 208.77 in Chinese yuan, as compared to $28.78, which that sounds like a lot, but obviously I don't know exactly how much like the average salary is in China. But um, if I go here to his receipt, he picked up crackers for half the price and the beef jerky for half the price, and then he made sure that he went with a higher up brand as well. So I also did the calculations right here. So the crackers in the U.S. graham crackers, he got regular, just like almost saltine crackers. Graham crackers in the U.S. were 3.29. So if you look at my receipt, you'll see the graham crackers are $3.29. Which if you go to the ones that he got, they were a buck 50, and then, the jerky that I got was 7.99, and the jerky that he got was 2.19, which is a higher brand. So as you could see, some of the stuff that he got there is significantly cheaper than that of what we got here. So there's the jerky that he got. As you could tell, normally I find that like the higher end jerky normally will have like some kind of animal on the front of it in a different colored bag. It seems to be the same way in China. And then the crackers that he got were, like I said, they're like saltine crackers, but close enough. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it kind of gives you a loose idea of the cost of living, or the cost of groceries there versus here. So without further ado, I'll get you back into the podcast where we kind of talk about this. All right. Thanks. Before I came home today, I went to Giant Eagle, which is like a pretty decent, like grocery store chain. They're a little bit pricier, not like insanely pricier, but pricier than like your Walmart or your Shop and Save or something like that, right? So I got beef jerky for $8, 7.99 to be exact. Graham crackers, the generic brand, for 3.29. I got two little hydration things. They were both $4.50. Two things of sugar-free syrup, which were both 3.99, and the tax was 54 cents. I spent $30 for jerky, graham crackers, a little bit of hydration mix, which the things are probably only like this big, and sugar-free syrup. How much do you think that would have been if you would have went to a supermarket in China?
Well, my wife loves to drive now. She got her license last year.
Okay.
So one thing we do is when we stop at gas stations in China on these long trips that she likes to take, is we buy beef jerky. And so I
Oh,
don't know the amount.
you
It's
picked right.
hard. It's yeah. Oh my gosh, it's delicious. It's great for a car ride, right? You're just
Yeah.
snack a little bit at a time. But I don't know the exact amounts, and it's difficult to convert the total amounts, but I would say it's about half the cost. I'm just
Mm,
ballparking here. But not everything is actually less expensive. I think that is something we need to take in mind. One product specifically that I know
mm,
that is more expensive in China is milk.
mm.
So, like in the United States, milk is actually very affordable compared to most countries in the world. And in China, specifically, milk is much more expensive. And the reason is there's not a huge cattle industry in China. You don't
Right.
ever just suddenly off of the highway see fields of thousands of cows like you do in the United States.
Mm.
I grew up in a place called Oakdale, part of my life, and it was just cows. I mean, every direction you could drive, it was just cows for like 100 miles everywhere, and tens of thousands of head of cattle everywhere. Just huge super farms, and China doesn't have that. China grows pork mostly, actually
Mm.
huge amounts of pigs. And so when you smell that, is that cow manure smell? It's pigs and driving around in China. So
Oh,
milk is very expensive.
yeah.
A lot of it's imported from Australia and the United States, New Zealand, and elsewhere. But almost every other category of food you can think of is like half, a third, the cost of what it costs in the United States. And this is interesting. Even things like Lay's. Why? Lays are actually made where they're sold. Lays don't like get made in the United States and shipped to China. Lays then just gets potatoes in China. So Lays are more
Mm,
or less expensive. So if you go to like the grocery store to buy American products from Johnson and Johnson, they have their own factories set up in China. And
mm,
so a lot of like the razor that I use, whatever Gillette, I think it's Johnson and Johnson, that's made here in China. So it's actually slightly less expensive than it is in the United States. Why? Because the inputs are less expensive. You know, so for example, electricity, state-owned enterprise, less expensive for your factory. Um, so telecommunications, it's owned by a state-owned enterprise. So gigabyte of data in China, less expensive. So if you're a factory and water is less expensive and electricity is less expensive and telecommunications are less expensive, logistics and distribution are less expensive, what does that mean for your product? It can be less expensive. So a lot of things in China are cheaper because the inputs are controlled by state-owned enterprises, what the United States used to call utilities before everything became privatized. And
mm,
so that they're a lot cheaper. In the United States, all of these things have been privatized, even rail. So it's less efficient uh, for the inputs for the factories that are using it. It might be more efficient for the company who owns the rail, making profit for its shareholders, but it's more expensive for everyone else who's trying to ship by rail or use that electricity. So all kinds of products, especially eggs, I know that that's a real big problem in the United States right now,
mm.
are much cheaper than in the United States. If you send me those receipts, I'll go buy something similar and send you some pictures. It's not a problem. The grocery store is like a block from my house.
All right. Well, I'm definitely going to do that. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, so I'm sure you know who Peter Zeihan is, and
Mm.
I listen to him and take some of his stuff with a grain of salt. And I do the same thing with John Mearsheimer because I think he has generally good insights, but then as soon as he comes to China, I think he loses his mind a little bit. Um, is China headed for a demographic collapse by 2030? Because Peter Zeihan says that by 2030, the population in China is going to be halved.
Um, is the Chinese population decreasing? Yes. And by 20, I think it's like 2050 or 20, I can't, maybe 2100, I can't remember which one it is. The population is expected to be less than 1 billion instead of 1.4 billion.
Mhm.
Uh, by 2030 is ludicrous. Okay, if you look at Japan, the United States, Canada, Germany, and a few other countries, China has the least problematic demographic issues in terms of the speed with which its elderly population are retiring. There are several issues with demographic decline. The several issues that pop up at the same time. One of those is elder care. How do you
Mhm.
take care of your elderly population? Another one is a separate issue is who works and who makes the stuff. So we need to look at these two are the biggest issues and look at them individually to understand them. China has more factory robots than the entire rest of the world, all the other 200 countries or
Mhm.
so combined.
Oh.
So, is there a demographic problem with related to the workforce in China? No. So let's put that one off. Okay, so now elder care. Uh, is there an issue with taking care of elderly people in China? In a pure capitalist nation or a nation with very severe deregulation and a different culture, it might be, but not in China, because you are actually legally responsible in China, and this is for better or worse. But this is problematic. I'm gonna point out the bad with the good here. I'm not gonna just say China great. You are required to take care of your parents.
Mm.
So if you every one of these people who have migrated from the countryside to the city and their parents still live in the countryside, firstly there is a culture, Confucian culture, of you must take care of your parents. So people want to, 95% of kids do very well take care of their parents. So all the kids, they moved to the cities, they went to universities, they got these great jobs, they're making all this money, they're living in high rises and stuff in Shanghai and Beijing and whatever, and they're sending all this money, and they're you buy a new phone in China every year, by the way. I don't know what it's like
Mm.
in the United States anymore. You send your phone from last year back to grandpa, and
Mhm.
grandpa's got like the state of the art phone. So I go to my wife's. My wife is Chinese. I go to her parents' house. It's full of some of our old stuff. They've got her old laptops and stuff. They're living the high life. Plus, they have their own money. Actually, they're really good at saving. China saves like 40% of their income. It's actually problematic. The economists want them to spend more money, but Chinese people save 40% of their income on average. That's just an average. So there's no problem with being able to hire people. But really, I think and this is just me being sci-fi, we're going to all have, in 5 years in China, I don't know what it's going to be like in other countries, all of these humanoid robots, which are actually being trained. You can watch footage of it being trained to fold laundry and stuff. In 10 years, it's going to be outrageous. And by the way, 2030, that's insane. If that's what Zayan's saying, I can't even believe
I might be
made that
mistaken
crap
at
up.
that. Yeah.
That is just nuts. Will there be it's going to be a slow burning fire for the next 20 years, and then it's kind of going to go away. And I'm going to, it's going to go away because people, they don't last forever.
Right.
So, yeah. So, eventually this is not going to be a problem. Will the population of China decrease? Yes. Is it going to destroy Chinese society? No. Like, it's insane to think that.
Yeah, I might be wrong on the date, but I know he said it might have been by 2050 that he said the population was going to be halved. I could be mistaken though. So someone, if you're listening to this, please correct me. You mentioned the saving rates in China was 40%, which is just absolutely insane. So I just Googled real quick. As of December 2024, the U.S. personal savings rate was 3.8%, which is below the long-term average of 8.43%.
I think that's a problem because of debt issues. There's a lot of credit card debt. Student loans are insane in the United States and so forth. And I think you probably know a lot more about that than I do. One of the reasons that's true is because in Chinese society, it's a very different culture. And I can't emphasize how different it is in terms of how families work together. It's so familial. So when a kid, when a young person who's in their 20s is getting married, the parents and the grandparents of these kids buy them a home, usually, or pay for at least part of it. Usually, by the time you're 30, not only do you have your own home with your spouse, but you don't have a mortgage. I'm sorry to say that to people in the United States. It must hurt your feelings.
Believe me, it stings a lot.
Yeah, so like
2 months, it's going to be 8 years that I've been in this house. So yeah, wow. And I still got 22 to go.
Right. So exactly. So why is it so easy to save in China? You own your home, no mortgage. Imagine how easy saving would be. So firstly, healthcare also super cheap or doesn't exist. My wife, actually, as of recording this show, she has pneumonia. She's currently in the hospital. She is hospitalized for 2 days, and she's on a lot of different medicine. And we had to pay for it all up front, and we're going to get some of that back. It was 4,000 RMB, which is like, I don't know, $500 for her to live in the hospital for 2 days, and all of her medicine, all of her care. And that $500 is going to be probably mostly paid back. We'll end up paying out of pocket after we're reimbursed by the Chinese national health system, like $100.
That is insane. Yeah.
Yeah. So savings is easy in that context, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas I think a lot of people here people were talking about this recently where, and I'm not going to get these numbers right at all, so I'm not even going to try, but basically like where their income compared to like what their house was worth on average here in the United States is like so drastically different from what it was 20, 30 years ago, where like, some people used to make, let's say like 40 grand a year back 40 years ago, and their house was about the same price, maybe even less. And then nowadays, like I think we were talking off the show, or maybe a little bit towards the beginning, where like, the average house here in the United States is like $400,000, and the median household income in the United States is $84,000, and the average income in the United States per person is about $64,000. So, now imagine the hill you have to climb where, you're making 60 grand a year, which is about, let's say, what would that be? About 25 or so an hour. And then you have to pay off a house that is what, 8 years of your salary. Like, how are you ever going to get that paid off? And then cars too. I think we might've talked about this last time, and I know I talked about it with Carl. The EV market here, I just put a battery in a EV Hummer a couple weeks ago, and like I am in love with this thing. I absolutely love these things. I mean, if I could afford one, I'd have one in a heartbeat. So of course, I drove it home just to verify that it was repaired correctly, and I was the first one in our shop to do it. So I'm pretty proud of that, and I genuinely enjoyed it. That vehicle is $108,000, if I remember correctly,
Wow.
108 or 115, right? For an EV Hummer, which if you sit in the inside of it, it's a little bit bigger than like a GMC Terrain, so like a mid-size SUV. But I mean, the thing's fucking badass. It's breathtaking driving this fucking thing. But my understanding is you go to China, you can get a EV for about 10 grand.
10 grand Chinese, actually. Oh no, I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry,
10
dollars.
grand
I
US.
actually I was US. I was looking at another guy, Lee Barrett. He does tech in China. If you might want to ask him about Huawei stuff in the future.
I'm writing it down. Yes.
Yeah, I was looking at a post that he did yesterday. They just added a smart system to a new car that BYD makes, a Chinese car company, and it is now about $10,000 to buy a smart car which can drive itself, and that is an
Wow.
EV. So with charging stations all over China, we have really excellent infrastructure for charging in China. So I think one of the reasons a lot of Americans don't want an EV, one of the many reasons, is where am I going to charge this thing? It's not a problem in China.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of infrastructure here for that in the US. So that Hummer, yeah, $108,000. The battery costs General Motors about $1,760 to make. And if you don't return the battery, and you only have 30 days to do this, GM will charge you $37,000 if you don't return the battery. So yeah, it's absolutely insane. And then like the other, because I work for Buick GMC Cadillac, the cheaper the EVs amongst these is the Cadillac Lyric, which is an SUV, and it's probably like the size of probably about the same, like a mid-size SUV. That one, a cheaper one, will probably run you about $65,000 to $70,000, and they're going to come out with the Lyric V, which is I'm sure is just going to knock your socks off. But it's really really neat. So while we're on the topic of technology, though, I want to talk about artificial intelligence, because a lot of Trump's administration is focused on AI. And I think it was Mark Andreessen who's made the AI czar for the Trump administration. These guys are major China hawks, and they seem to be intent upon the point that China cannot be the one to rule AI. This is the battle for the 21st century. And if China takes over AI, it's all over for us. What do you think?
My goodness, what a huge topic. We can't cover the scope of this topic, but for personal use stuff, like as a normal person, I like using all of it. I go on DeepSeek. I've tried Quen, which is the Alibaba one, Jack Ma's AI, and I love ChatGPT also. So I kind of just play with whatever I feel like at the moment. Like as long as I use the free one, I don't care. In terms of like, what is the United States doing? It's clear that the United States has lost being the forefront of technology in a lot of different fields, and China is pulled ahead. And so I think there was a feeling in the United States that, well, we have Silicon Valley, and if we prevent China from getting all of these microchips, we'll be able to stay ahead. That's what Gina Raimondo, the former Secretary of Commerce from the Biden administration, said. We're going to have a small yard with a high fence, and this is a metaphor for we're going to keep all the best microprocessors in our country and our very closest allies, and no one else is going to be able to. There's another Trump gesture. No one else is going to be able to touch them. Yep. And so that didn't work. So we need to, in order to talk about AI, we need to talk about semiconductors too, and why the United States is ultimately going to lose that race soon in the next couple of years. Because yes, currently the United States and its close friends who are hoarding this technology, they have the ability to make the most precise, smallest semiconductors that are the best, and China doesn't. But China can do something that the United States can't do. It can scale things very fast. And so all of the other processors that are above 7 nanometers, China's reaction to being cut off was, well, we don't really make these. We were relying on you because you guys made the best ones, but now you're saying we can't have them. So they just mass produced all of the ones that they had the ability to produce. So now all of the semiconductor companies in the West that were like also making these larger chips that are used in your coffee machine and your laptop. No, you don't put a 1 nanometer microchip in your laptop, by the way, or a 2 nanometer laptop doesn't go in your coffee machine or your R watches. Those are much larger microchips that are not that important. And so all of the stuff that everyone was buying all over the world can now be made in China for a fraction of the cost. So this means that companies like NVIDIA and other companies that were making these high-end chips are having their R&D gutted because they don't have the profitability to maintain their R&D. So meanwhile, China has now created several patented lithography machines. For people who don't know, those are required to make these higher-end chips.
Mm-hmm.
So now they don't need this company in Holland, which was sanctioned. China was sanctioned by the United States through Holland to not be able to buy this technology. Now China can basically make this technology domestically. So now China was very happy and very content to buy this from other countries. It didn't care about this market. But once China and Gina Raimondo and Biden cut China off, China was like, well, we have no alternative to making it ourselves. So I guess we'll do that. So in a very short period of time, China has ramped up its ability, or rather ramped down its smaller abilities to make these very small elite chips. And we're talking about AI. They're already using larger chips than the chips that these huge Silicon Valley companies like OpenAI, which makes a closed system, by the way. Why do they call it open? It's not open. So ChatGPT or closed GPT is making these huge, massive data-dependent systems to create artificial intelligence. What DeepSeek represented, not Quinn. Quinn is a little more expensive. What DeepSeek represented was they made something just as good at 1,000th the cost. Mm-hmm. So they spent like $10 million to make DeepSeek with bigger microchips, which are less refined. That's basically a match for closed GPT, which now, and what's interesting about DeepSeek's model is it doesn't want to say this is ours, which is what ChatGPT is doing. This is ours. They're letting anyone download their software. So already companies in the United States and all over the world are just downloading DeepSeek, copying it, modifying it. Now they have their own AI. So, you're a developing country, you're a company and you live in Ethiopia. You have the servers, you download DeepSeek, you modify it. Now Ethiopia has its own open AI. So this actually kind of destroys the market for these American companies because they're like, this is our proprietary information and we're going to be the only one. And China is like, everyone can have this. And so who's gonna need to use it? People who want to use it obviously will, and they'll buy a subscription. But it's something the rest of the world is going to be dependent on anymore. It's going to be something that any country can have for a very low cost, and it's going to be like, do you really want an iPhone, or are you okay with a Samsung, right? Samsung's great. It does it for me. I don't need an iPhone. So these Silicon Valley AI tech firms are going to be like the Apple of that. They're very elite. They're very good, but you can get the same product from someone else that's almost exactly identical.
Okay. Yeah, and the other point that I really wanted to toss on here, and I'm curious your thoughts as well, is that why should we assume that China is going to have nefarious intents with AI? Because if you look at the way that the U.S. has acted on the world stage over the last 30 years, I mean, it's not clear to me that we're going to be the benevolent dictator when it comes to AI. So, I've made the point to people before. We go into countries with bombs and China goes in with a briefcase, and, choose which one you want, because, if you ask me, I'd rather have a briefcase than a bomb. So, and clearly a lot of other people are starting to kind of think that as well.
That's a really good point. I think there's a psychological term. I can't remember who said it. It's a Chinese gentleman who is a psychologist in the United States. And
Mhm.
he said the best predictor for future behavior is past behavior.
Yep.
So nations around the world are looking at the United States and China. I don't think they need to choose. I don't think it's like we don't live in the Soviet bloc era where you have to choose between the United States and the Soviets. I think countries are choosing their own path. I think if you go ask Sudan, who would you rather be friends with, the United States or China, which the United States arrogantly does sometimes, Sudan's going to say neither. We're choosing the path for Sudan. So like we don't live in a world where you have to choose, but if you're going to look at Chinese behavior and the US behavior, since 1980, the United States has probably been in, I don't know, I'm just ballparking it. I could name some names, but I don't think it's necessary. 50 countries that we've had some kind of coup in or invaded or supplied weapons to in arms.
Mhm.
China has had zero. So who should we be concerned about? I think your point is very valid. But I also think that maybe Trump is changing that. At least he says he wants a less hostile foreign policy. So I'm hoping I know I can't say this is going to happen. I'm hoping the United States kind of pulls back into itself and invests more in the republic and spends less money on the empire. So, but we'll have to see what time brings us because no one knows the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I couldn't agree more specifically with kind of pulling into America and kind of doing what Trump said he was going to do and make America great again. He failed in his first term. His second term, I got to say, I'm pleasantly surprised as a guy who really went to bat against Trump. Not telling people, hey, don't vote for him. I just said, like, hey, be aware what you're getting. There's still things that I vehemently disagree with, and I still think there's issues, but it's starting off on a lot better of a foot than I thought. And even in the foreign policy realm, I think there were some more positive developments than I expected initially. But time will tell if that changes. So, um, Jason, I want to be respectful of your time. You've given plenty of knowledge. And I thoroughly enjoy talking to you because, like I said, this is just a passion project of mine to learn everything I can about China. So that way I can share this with other people. And hopefully one day I'll be able to go visit. Carl Zoss seems to say that the waves in Bali, which I know this isn't part of China, but he said the waves in Bali are great, but I'm sure the cities in China are great as well. So why don't you tell everybody where they could find you and find out more about your podcast and all the great information services that you provide?
If you just look up the Bridge to China podcast in Google, you'll find us. It'll be the first page. You can also find me on Twitter. This is hard to say, at Shangguanjie1. So good luck with that one.
It'll be in the description below. But yeah, everybody, please make sure you go check out his content. Go to the YouTube channel where he has tons of videos that are pretty short, easily digestible, and then like you said, lots of great content on A Bridge to China. I just find all your conversations absolutely fascinating. So, Jason, one more time, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, sir.
Of course.